Welcome to episode 1 of the Beer Taster's Notebook. If you're very new to beer, this is the episode with which to start. If, however, you've been studying beer for a while, feel free to either skip or hang around. What follows will be a very basic and rudimentary introduction to beer. So what is beer? So beer is an alcoholic beverage made by the fermentation of grains. Sugars are extracted from grains, predominantly barley, bittered and flavored with hops, and then converted into ethanol, carbon dioxide, and a few other byproducts by a microorganism we call yeast. So basically, we feed the yeast some sugar water and it excretes metabolic products, which we then call beer. Let's start in the barley field. So barley is a cereal grass related to wheat and rye. It's fairly climate tolerant, but it does prefer cooler climates and well-drained soil. There are two main variants that we use for brewing, 2-row and 6-row. These are named for the number of rows of kernels visible when looking directly down at the head from above. So 2-row has fewer but plumper kernels, and 6-row has the inverse. Once the barley is matured and harvested, it is then soaked until it reaches around 45% moisture, and then left to germinate. So germination is the start of a new plant. This is important because it begins the process of allowing endogenous enzymes to start opening up starch reserves, which would be used for energy for the new plant, but which we're going to use to make beer. So the germination is halted when the desired level of modification is reached. This is done by basically removing moisture via a kiln. So now that we have basic malt, we can decide whether we want more flavor and darker colors. And so this barley can then be further kilned or introduced to a roaster in the case of sort of the darker chocolate malts and black malts. It's important to know that the darker the malt, the higher the temperature and the longer the exposure, which means that you have fewer viable enzymes. So enzymes are catalysts in chemical reactions that do not get consumed in the reaction. They're proteins. They're folded in a very specific way, and each enzyme acts on a very specific part of the reaction. So they're very sensitive to heat, and once they've denatured, meaning they unravel, they won't renature. So something like black malt is going to have basically zero enzymes, but something very light like pale or pilsner malt will have a lot of enzymatic potential because they haven't been heated enough to kill them all. So now that we have malt, it needs to be crushed. We need to crack it open to make those starches available. And this is done through a mill. The crush size is very important. And we can do an entire episode about the crush, but the takeaway here is that there needs to be a balance between exposing the starches and keeping the husk intact. So the husk will act as a filter bed when we get to the mash, but the husk also contains polyphenols. And you've likely heard of, or probably experienced really, tannins in black tea or red wine, and a tannin is a type of polyphenol. So, you know, when you oversteep tea and it makes your mouth feel really dry and rough, and it feels like it's kind of sticking, your mouth is sticking to your teeth. That's a function of it being overly saturated with tannins. So this is something you don't want in beer. In fact, it's something you don't want in tea either, but that's a whole different issue. So we don't want to crush those husks too much so that we've freed up those polyphenols to be extracted into the final beer. So the crushed grain is now loaded into what we call a mash tun. And the mash tun is a giant temperature-controlled vessel. This is in a commercial setting. At a homebrew setting, it's often a cooler, just something that will keep temperatures fairly stable for the duration of the mash. So in this mash tun, the crushed grains are mixed with warm water, which will begin to extract the starches, and it activates specific enzymes which will convert those starches into fermentable sugars. Basically, it just chews them up into smaller pieces. There are very specific mash temperature ranges and very different techniques for mashing, but again, these are deeper topics for another day. So once these starches have been converted, hotter water is added to halt any more enzymatic activity and lock down the fermentables. So this is called the mash out, and it basically it's just stops everything. And now what we got is what we've got. Now this liquid full of fermentable sugars is called wort, W-O-R-T, and so this liquid is now often recirculated through that mash And this allows the grain bed to settle, and it also sort of pre-filters it. So it's run until it's fairly clear what's coming out. This is called the Vorlauf. This wort is then drained into a boil kettle, and then more hot water is sprinkled over top of the mash to essentially wash the grains of any residual sugars. This is called sparging, and this will continue until target gravity, which is the amount of sugar dissolved in the liquid, or a target volume, so that the gross volume of liquid has been reached. The wort is then boiled. Bittering hops are added at the start of the boil. So let's just quickly talk about hops. Hops are a plant that's related to cannabis. They grow on these tall vine-like structures called bines. And the part that we use in beer is called the strobile, or often called the hop cone. So it's essentially the flower, right? You should look it up so that you know exactly what it looks like. But basically, there's a stem in the middle called a strig. And then from that stem, there are these petals or scales almost, they look like, called bracts, underneath which are bracteoles, which contain the lupulin glands. So lupulin is like it's like a sticky yellow powder, and in that are the alpha acids, beta acids, and all of the aromatic volatiles that make hops so delicious. So the boil normally lasts for 60 to 90 minutes. What it does is sterilize the wort. It concentrates it a little bit just via evaporation. It helps to blow off some volatile compounds that can cause off flavors. And it does produce some flavor via Maillard reactions and caramelization, especially if it's direct fired. And then almost of utmost importance, it isomerizes the alpha acids in the hops, meaning that they structurally rearrange so they could become more soluble and impart bitterness into the beer. Hops in their native form are not very soluble, so this is pretty essential. At the end of the boil, we can add some more hops in, and these are called flavoring hops or aroma hops. The wort is then cooled down as quickly as possible for multiple reasons, but mainly we don't want to sit in that sweet spot where A, some off flavors can start to redevelop, or B, we don't want to be exposed to any kind of infection. And so once it hits target temperature, the yeast is pitched and fermentation begins. So just a quick introduction to the yeast. There are two main varieties used in brewing. Lager yeast called Saccharomyces pastorianus, which is also called bottom fermenting yeast, and Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the ale yeast, which is also called top fermenting yeast. So, I mean, I could talk for hours and hours about yeast, and let's not do that right now. So once the fermentation is complete, in the case of ales, the beer is either filtered, or unless it's not filtered, pasteurized unless it's unpasteurized, and then it's packaged for consumption. With lagers, the lagering process means maturing the beer at colder temperatures, and this adds a few weeks onto the process and really strips out pretty much any off flavors it can. So for packaging, in some cases it's force carbonated, actually in a lot of cases, and then in certain cases it's what they call bottle conditioned, which means there's some metabolically viable yeast remains in the bottle along with some residual sugars. It continues to eat up those sugars, and then it produces the carbon dioxide and gives us that fizz that we love. So that's a quick overview of the brewing process. So let's just introduce some beer styles. So we'll go through every single style in depth over the next while. But just as a brief overview, like you just break it down to their lagers, ales, and wild ferments. And I think wild ferment is kind of a nutty term because, I mean, sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it actually is wild, but we'll just use it as sort of an extra category of things like sour beers and Brettanomyces beers or whatnot. But the two main categories are going to be lagers and ales. There are also some hybrids, which would be like a beer that's brewed with lager yeast, but in ale conditions and temperatures, and then vice versa. Once again, we'll get to all of this down the road. So hopefully that provided a clear yet simple overview of beer. We have a lot to talk about in the following episodes, and I look forward to speaking with you soon. Cheers.